The Dragon of Seoul doesn't stop for anyone. But when two tiny pairs of small, trembling hands grabbed his jacket. The most dangerous man in Korea didn't just stop, he froze. His security detail reached for their holsters. But Do-yoon raised a single, gloved hand. Silence fell. Even the rain seemed to hesitate. Please, a voice whispered. A tiny, fractured sound that bypassed his armor and struck his heart like a poisoned needle. Save our mummy. The bad man. He won't let her breathe. Do-yoon looked down. Two identical faces. 5 years old. Braids coming undone. But it wasn't their fear that stopped his breath. It was their eyes. Amber. Sharp. A perfect, terrifying mirror of his own. And then the wind shifted. Across the golden-lit entrance, under the shadow of a marble pillar, he saw her. Nia Laurent. She was pinned in a corner, her back against the cold stone. A man, Dominic Reed, was leaning into her space, his hand gripping her wrist with the casual cruelty of a man who thought he owned the world. Nia's chest was heaving, her eyes unfocused, a panic attack clawing at her throat. The world turned red. 6 years ago, Do-yoon had been a man running from assassins. Tonight, he was the assassin. He didn't look at his guards. He didn't look at the twins. He looked only at the man touching what was his. Stay with them. Do-yoon commanded his lead bodyguard, his voice a low, tectonic growl. The dragon didn't believe in fate. He believed in debt. And tonight, he was going to collect every drop of interest Dominic Reed owed for the last 6 years. He stepped out of the rain and back into the light. The Gala music was still playing. But for Han Do-yoon, the only sound was the rhythmic thud of a predator reclaiming his territory. I told myself I'd never walk away twice, he whispered to the shadows. Tonight, I burn the world to keep her warm. The dragon's reach is global, but I want to know how far our story has traveled today. Before we see what Do-yoon does to reclaim his family, drop a comment and let me know which city and country you're watching from. I read every single comment you leave. And if you want to help this family grow and see justice served, hit that like and subscribe button. It truly helps us bring more of this story to life. The ballroom behind him was a cage of gold and lies, but the air outside was a battlefield of ice and memory. Han Do-yoon didn't walk, he surged. Every step he took toward the marble pillar where Nia Laurent was trapped felt like the slow, rhythmic cocking of a heavy-caliber weapon. The Gala music had faded into a dull, underwater hum, replaced by the jagged sound of Nia's gasping breath. It was a sound that scraped against his soul, a sound of a woman drowning on dry land. Dominic Reed didn't hear him coming. He was too busy leaning into Nia's personal space, his face twisted into a smirk of predatory entitlement. Don't be dramatic, Nia, Dominic sneered, his fingers tightening around her wrist until the skin turned a ghostly white. You were always a runner, but you have nowhere to go tonight. Who's going to help you? These two little mistakes you call daughters. The word mistakes acted as the final spark in a room full of gasoline. Do-yoon reached the pillar. He didn't shout. He didn't announce himself. He simply reached out and placed a gloved hand on Dominic's shoulder. The contact was light, almost polite, but the moment Dominic felt the weight of it, he stiffened. There was an elemental coldness in that touch, the kind that emanated from a man who had looked into the abyss so many times that the abyss had started taking notes. Dominic spun around. His mouth opened to bark an insult, but the words died in his throat. He found himself looking up, way up, at a man whose eyes were the color of molten amber and old blood. Take your hand off her, Do-yoon said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a tectonic shift, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to vibrate the very stone of the grand ballroom. Who the hell are you? Dominic stammered, trying to regain his bravado, though his knees were visibly shaking. He looked at Do-yoon's tailored tuxedo, the expensive watch, and the 4 stone-faced men who had silently fanned out behind him, cutting off every exit. This is a private conversation. Get lost. Do-yoon didn't blink. He didn't even look at Dominic's face. His gaze was fixed on Nia's wrist, where Dominic's fingers still lingered. In one fluid, blurred motion, Do-yoon's hand moved. There was a sickening crack, the sound of a dry branch snapping in winter, followed by a high-pitched shriek of agony. Dominic tumbled backward, clutching a wrist that was now bent at an impossible, grotesque angle. "I won't ask a second time," Dune whispered. Nia collapsed. The panic attack had finally stolen the last of her strength. As her knees buckled, Dune was there. He caught her before she hit the wet pavement, pulling her small, trembling frame against the hard heat of his chest. She was burning up and freezing all at once. The scent of jasmine and rain-soaked lilies flooded his senses, more potent now than it had been 6 years ago in that darkened London hotel room. It was the scent of his greatest regret, and now it was the scent of his only mission. "Mummy!" Isla and Arya cried out in unison, their small voices piercing the tension. They huddled against Dune's legs, their tiny hands clutching his trousers. Dune looked down at them. For a split second, the predator vanished. He saw his own defiance in their eyes, his own stubbornness in the set of their jaws. They weren't mistakes. They were his legacy. "I have her," he told the girls, his voice softening just enough to keep them from shattering. "She's safe now. I promise." You maniac." Dominic was on the ground, cradling his broken arm, his face pale and sweating. He looked toward the entrance of the gala where his own security team, 4 hired thugs in cheap suits, were finally rushing out, alerted by the scream. "Kill him! Do you hear me? Break him!" Dominic's security team hesitated. They saw Dune holding the woman, but more importantly, they saw the 4 men standing behind him. Dune's men didn't reach for their guns. They didn't need to. They simply adjusted their stances, their eyes dead and vacant, the look of professionals who had ended more lives than they had lived. Dune adjusted his hold on Nia, lifting her effortlessly into a bridal carry. Her head fell against his shoulder, her ragged breaths warm against his neck. He turned his head slightly toward Dominic's security team. "Look at me," Dune commanded. The 4 thugs froze. There was something in Dune's gaze that made their survival instincts scream. It wasn't just the threat of violence. It was the absolute certainty of it. "My name is Han Dune," he said, and the name alone seemed to cause a temperature drop in the air. "You are standing between a dragon and his blood. If you take one step forward, I will not just kill you. I will erase the memory of your existence. I will find every person who shares your name, every place you have ever called home, and I will turn it all to ash. This is not a threat. This is the last mercy you will ever receive from me. Run. Now." One of the thugs dropped his gaze, his hand trembling. He had heard the stories. Everyone in the Seoul underworld had heard of the man who had dismantled the Iron Fang Syndicate in a single weekend. Without a word, the man turned and bolted into the rain. A second later, the other 3 followed, leaving Dominic Reed alone on the ground, broken and abandoned. "Wait! Come back! You cowards!" Dominic yelled, but his voice was drowned out by a clap of thunder that shook the sky. Dune didn't spare him another glance. He began to walk toward his idling armored sedan, the rain slicking his hair back, his stride steady despite the weight of the woman in his arms and the 2 children following closely at his heels. "Is Mummy going to be okay?" Arya whispered, her hand catching Dune's sleeve again. Dune stopped by the car door. He looked at the little girl, her face wet with rain and tears. He reached out with one finger and gently tucked a stray braid behind her ear. "She is going to be better than okay," he said. "She is going to be free." The lead bodyguard, Jin Ho, opened the rear door. Dune slid inside, carefully settling Nia into the plush leather seat, her head resting in his lap. He gestured for the twins to climb in on the other side. As the door clicked shut, the chaos of the gala and the screams of Dominic Reed were silenced by the soundproofing of the vehicle. The interior was warm, smelling of cedarwood and expensive leather. Nia stirred, her eyes fluttering open for a brief second. She looked up at the man holding her, her vision blurred by tears and the lingering fog of her panic. She saw the sharp jawline, the amber eyes, and the scar just below his ear. "London," she wheezed, her voice barely audible. Dune's hand, large and scarred, came up to stroke her cheek. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the hand that had just snapped a man's wrist. "I'm here, Nia. I've been looking for you for a very long time." "The girls," she gasped, her hand reaching out blindly. They are right here, he promised, guiding her hand to where Isla was sitting. They are safe. Everything is going to be different now. As the car pulled away from the curb, moving like a dark shark through the neon-lit streets of Seoul, Dune looked out the window. He watched the lights of the city blur into long golden streaks. For 6 years, he had been a man without a destination, moving through life with a cold, mechanical precision. He had built an empire, but it was an empire of ghosts. Now, he looked down at the woman in his lap and the 2 children who looked so much like him that it hurt to breathe. The dragon had spent his life hoarding power, but as Nia's breathing finally leveled out into a deep, exhausted sleep, he realized he had been poor until this very moment. He tapped the intercom to the front seat. Jin Ho. Yes, boss. Cancel all my meetings for the week. Call the private medical team to the penthouse. I want the best respiratory specialists and trauma counselors in the country waiting at the door. And Jin Ho. Sir. Find out everything there is to know about Dominic Reed. Every debt he owes. Every dark secret he's hiding. Every person he's ever hurt. By sunrise, I want his world to start shrinking. I want him to feel the walls closing in until the only air he has left to breathe belongs to me. Understood, boss. Consider it done. Dune turned off the intercom and leaned his head back against the seat. He felt a small, cold hand slip into his. He looked over to see Isla watching him with an intensity that was far beyond her 5 years. Are you our daddy? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. The question hung in the air, heavier than the rain outside. Dune had killed men without hesitating. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals with a shrug. But this one question made his heart stutter in a way he didn't know was possible. He looked at her, seeing the London night, the betrayal Nia had suffered, and the long road of struggle she must have walked to raise these girls alone. He thought of the $50,000 bet Dominic had made. A bet that had inadvertently created the only beautiful thing in Dune's life. I am, Dune said, his voice thick with a new, raw emotion. And I am never going to let anyone hurt you again. Isla nodded once, a solemn acceptance of his vow. She leaned her head against his arm, her eyes closing as the exhaustion of the night finally took hold. Beside her, Arya was already fast asleep, her head lolling against the seat. Dune sat in the silence of the moving car, a king who had finally found his kingdom. He knew that by morning, the news of what he had done at the gala would spread through the syndicate like wildfire. Choi Sung-woo would see this as a weakness. Kang Min-suk would see it as an opportunity to strike. They would think the dragon had grown soft because he had found something to love. They were wrong. Love didn't make a man like Han Dune soft. It made him infinite. It gave his violence a purpose and his darkness a direction. As the car climbed the hill toward his fortress-like penthouse, Dune looked down at Nia's peaceful face. The debt was 6 years old and the interest was high. But he was the Dragon of Seoul, and he always collected what was his. The rain continued to fall, washing away the glitter of the gala, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the war to come. But as Dune pulled Nia closer, he knew one thing for certain. The bad man wouldn't be the one taking her breath away anymore. From now on, the only thing that would make her heart race would be the man who had burned the world just to find his way back to her. He closed his eyes, listening to the 3 heartbeats that now matched his own. The hunt was over. The protection had begun. And God help anyone who tried to stand in his way. The car slowed as it approached the heavy security gates of his private residence. The guards at the gate, seeing the boss's car, stood at sharp attention. They didn't know the cargo he was carrying, but they could feel the change in the air. The restrained Dune they had known was gone. Something older and far more primal had returned to the nest. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent. Dune refused to let the orderlies take Nia from his arms. He carried her through the sprawling, minimalist living room and into the master suite, where the medical team was already waiting. Save her, he said to the lead doctor, his eyes narrowing. And if she wakes up scared, call me immediately. He stepped out of the room, leaving the professionals to work. He stood on the balcony, looking out over the flickering lights of Seoul. The city looked small from up here, vulnerable. Dominic Reed, he whispered into the wind, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the railing. You have no idea what you've started. He took a deep breath, the cold night air filling his lungs. For the first time in 6 years, the morning emptiness he had felt in London was gone. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a family to fight for, a woman to cherish, and a debt of blood to settle. The dragon was awake, and Seoul was about to find out exactly what that meant. The rhythmic hum of the medical monitors in the penthouse suite provided a steady, artificial heartbeat to the silence of the room. Han De-yoon stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the backdrop of the rain-slicked Seoul skyline. Behind him, Nia lay submerged in a sea of white silk sheets, her breathing finally deep and regular under the influence of the mild sedative the doctors had administered. In the adjoining room, the twins were asleep, guarded by men who would sooner die than let a shadow fall across their doorway. But Do-yoon's mind was no longer in Seoul. The scent of the rain, mixed with the lingering traces of jasmine from Nia's skin, acted as a sensory bridge, dragging him backward through time, across continents, to a night that had been the beginning and the end of his old life. London. 6 years ago. The city had been a labyrinth of cold fog and neon light. Do-yoon had arrived not as a billionaire, but as a soldier on the verge of a coup. He was there to finalize a shipping merger that would legitimize his family's European interests, but the shadows were closing in. His own second-in-command had sold his itinerary to a rival cartel, and by the time Do-yoon reached the high-end lounge in Mayfair, he knew he was being hunted. He could feel the eyes of the professionals in the room, men with suppressed weapons and hollow souls. He had ordered a drink, something strong to dull the edge of the adrenaline, unaware that the bartender had already been bought. The first sip had tasted of copper and citrus. By the second, the floor had begun to tilt. It wasn't just alcohol. It was a neurotoxin designed to paralyze his motor functions while leaving his mind conscious enough to feel the blade. Across the same crowded, smoke-filled bar, Nia Laurent had been sitting in a velvet booth, her laughter sounding like music she didn't quite feel. She was celebrating her engagement to Dominic Reed, a man whose family name carried more weight than his character. She was radiant in a dress the color of midnight, her dark skin glowing under the amber chandeliers. She believed she was starting a life of security and love. She didn't know that 10 feet away, Dominic was leaning over a table of his polo-playing friends, his eyes glazed with greed and malice. She's too perfect, Dominic, one of his friends had teased, sliding a thick envelope across the mahogany table. Too pure. I bet $50,000 she wouldn't even look at another man, let alone go home with one tonight. You're marrying a statue, not a woman. Dominic had smirked, his fingers itching for the cash. He didn't see Nia as a partner. He saw her as an asset to be leveraged. A statue can be moved if you know which lever to pull, Dominic had replied. He had already slipped a small, tasteless pill into Nia's champagne flute while she was in the powder room. He didn't want to lose the bet, and more importantly, he wanted to break her spirit just enough to ensure she would always be beneath him. The betrayal was twofold, occurring in the same room under the same roof. Two souls, unrelated and unknown to each other, were being systematically poisoned for the sake of power and a petty wager. As the drug took hold of Nia, her world began to blur into a kaleidoscope of terrifying colors. Her head felt heavy, her limbs turning to lead. She looked for Dominic, reaching out for the man she thought was her protector. But he was gone, intentionally melting into the crowd to give his competitors an opening. Terrified and disoriented, Nia had stumbled toward the elevators, her only instinct to find the safety of her hotel room. At the same moment, Do-yoon had stood up, his vision tunneling. He saw the assassins moving toward him from the corners of the bar. He had to move. He had to disappear. His training took over, a primal survival mechanism that operated even as his nervous system began to fail. He pushed through the heavy gold doors of the elevator just as the doors were closing, collapsing against the mirrored wall. Nia was already inside, slumped in the corner. Neither spoke. They were two ghosts in a rising metal box. The elevator chimed on the penthouse floor, a floor Do-yoon hadn't booked, but one his fuddled brain insisted was his sanctuary. He stepped out, his shoulder hitting the doorframe, and Nia followed, her hand gripping the back of his tuxedo jacket for balance. She didn't know who he was. She only knew he was the only thing standing upright in a world that was falling apart. He reached for a door at the end of the hall. It was unlocked, a fatal mistake by a maid or perhaps another twist of a cruel fate. He stumbled inside, the darkness of the suite swallowing them both. He didn't turn on the lights. He couldn't risk the silhouette against the window. He locked the door behind them, the click of the deadbolt sounding like a gunshot in the silence. "Dominic," Nia had whispered, her voice a fractured glass sound. She reached out in the dark, her hand finding the rough texture of Duyun's silk tie. Duyun froze. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The toxin in his blood was demanding he sleep, but the adrenaline of the hunt was demanding he fight. He felt the heat of her body, the scent of jasmine rising from her skin, mixing with the metallic tang of his own cold sweat. In the darkness, he couldn't see her face, but he felt her trembling. It wasn't the tremble of a woman in passion. It was the shivering of a creature in a storm. "No," he managed to grunt, his voice a low, guttural rasp. He tried to push her away, to find the bed and collapse, but Nia clung to him. The drug Dominic had given her was stripping away her inhibitions, replacing her fear with a desperate, chemical-induced need for contact. She pressed her face into the crook of his neck, her breath hot against his skin. To her, he wasn't a mafia boss or a predator. He was the only solid thing in a shifting universe. "Don't leave me," she sobbed, her fingers digging into his shoulders. "Everything is dark. Please, make it stop." Duyun's resolve shattered. He was a man who had been raised in a world of violence and calculated distance. He had never been touched with such raw, unguarded need. The poison in his system began to warp his perceptions. The woman in his arms became his anchor. He turned, his hands finding her waist, pulling her flush against him. The encounter that followed was not one of romance, but of survival. It was a collision of two people who had been betrayed by the world, finding a desperate, incandescent heat in the center of a cold night. They were drugged souls, as the poets might say, but the connection was more real than anything Duyun had ever felt. In the silence of that London suite, away from the assassins and the gamblers, they became each other's sanctuary. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his face. They only knew the rhythm of their breathing and the way their heartbeats seemed to synchronize in the dark. When the first gray light of a London morning began to creep through the heavy velvet curtains, the reality of the world returned with a vengeance. Duyun woke first. The toxin had processed through his liver, leaving him with a skull-splitting headache and a mouth that tasted of ash. He sat up, the silk sheets falling away to reveal the chaotic state of the room. He looked down and finally saw her face. Even in sleep, she looked haunted. Her dark hair was fanned out across the white pillow, and her lips were slightly parted. She looked like an angel that had been dragged through hell. Panic, a sensation he hadn't felt since childhood, seized him. He heard voices in the hallway, hushed, professional tones. The assassins were still looking for him. If they found him here, they would kill her too. He couldn't stay. He couldn't explain. He was a man of the shadows, and his presence was a death sentence to anyone he touched. He dressed with mechanical speed, his hands shaking as he adjusted his cufflinks. He looked at the woman one last time, a singular, burning image he would carry in his mind for the next 6 years. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hair, to leave a note, but he had nothing. He was a ghost. He slipped out of the room just as a cleaning cart rounded the corner, providing him the distraction he needed to reach the service stairs. By the time Nia woke up an hour later, the room was empty. The only proof that the night had happened was the lingering scent of his cologne and the heavy weight of a silence she couldn't understand. Nia had woken into a nightmare. She remembered the bar, the champagne, and then a blurred mountain of a man. She looked at her engagement ring on the nightstand and felt a wave of nausea. She thought she had cheated. She thought she had destroyed her life. When Dominic found her an hour later, acting the part of the frantic, worried fiancé, he didn't tell her about the drug. He didn't tell her about the bet. He let her believe she was the one who had failed. "How could you, Nia?" Dominic had sneered, his eyes gleeful behind a mask of faux sorrow. With a stranger? You're lucky I'm a forgiving man. But you'll have to spend the rest of your life making this up to me. She had believed him. She had carried the guilt like a stone in her chest for years, unaware that the stranger in the dark had been the only one in that hotel who hadn't intended to hurt her. She had fled London months later when she realized she was pregnant, terrified that Dominic would find out the twins weren't his, or worse, that he would use them against her. She had disappeared into the world, changing her name, moving from city to city, until fate finally brought her to Seoul. Standing in the penthouse 6 years later, Dune let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned away from the window and walked back to the bed where Nia lay. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering over her forehead before finally, gently, brushing a stray lock of hair away. The wrong room hadn't been an accident. He saw that now. It had been a crucible. The twins, Isla and Arya, were currently in the next room, dreaming of a father they had only just met. They were the living evidence of that night, the only beautiful thing to ever come out of the violence of his life. He looked at Nia's face, seeing the toll the last 6 years had taken on her. She had been running from a ghost, not knowing that the ghost had been looking for her every single day. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a secure message from Jin-ho. *Boss. We've traced the transaction from London. The $50,000 bet Dominic Reed made? It wasn't his money. The funds were wired from an offshore account linked to the Choi syndicate. They didn't just want you dead that night, boss. They wanted you disgraced. They knew about the girl. Dune's eyes turned into shards of ice. The amber glow in his pupils intensified until it looked like a controlled fire. It hadn't been a random encounter. The wrong room had been a setup. The Choi syndicate had used Nia as bait, intending to capture Dune in a compromising position to blackmail his father and destroy the Han bloodline. But they had underestimated two things: the potency of the toxins they had used, and the sheer, unyielding will of Han Dune to protect what he claimed as his. The night in London hadn't been the end of a hit. It had been the beginning of a war. And Dominic Reed wasn't just an abusive ex-fiancé. He was a pawn in a game that was much larger and much bloodier than Nia could ever imagine. Dune leaned down, his lips brushing Nia's temple. "Sleep now," he whispered, his voice a promise of absolute destruction. "The dragon is home, and the fire is coming for everyone who touched you." He walked out of the room, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. In the living room, his security team stood at attention. Jin-ho stepped forward, handing him a tablet. "The Choi syndicate has moved their assets to the Incheon docks. Boss, they think you're distracted by the woman and the children. They're planning to hit the penthouse at dawn." Dune didn't even look at the tablet. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held Nia in the dark in London, the same hands that had snapped Dominic's wrist at the gala. "They think I'm distracted?" Dune asked, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "They're right. I am distracted. I'm distracted by the 6 years of my daughter's lives I missed. I'm distracted by every tear Nia shed because of them. And that distraction is going to make me the most dangerous thing they have ever seen." He looked at the clock. 3 hours until dawn. "Call the men," Dune commanded. "We aren't waiting for them to hit the penthouse. We're going to Incheon. I want to see the look on Choi Sung-woo's face when he realizes that the bait he used 6 years ago just gave me a reason to burn his entire world to the ground." "And the woman and children, boss?" Jin-ho asked. "Double the perimeter," Dune said. "If so much as a fly enters this building without my permission, I want the walls painted with its blood. Nia and the girls are the only things that matter now. The rest of the world can burn." As he stepped into the private elevator, the scent of jasmine followed him. It was no longer a scent of regret or a ghost of the past. It was his battle flag. The Dragon of Seoul was no longer fighting for territory or money. He was fighting for the wrong room that had turned out to be the only right thing he had ever done. The elevator descended, and as the doors opened to the garage where a fleet of black SUVs sat idling like beasts in the dark, Dune checked his weapon. The click of the magazine seating into the grip was the final note of the prologue. The London debt was about to be paid in full, and Han Dune was coming to collect. The hum of the city below was a distant, muted roar, filtered through the triple-glazed reinforced glass of the penthouse. Inside the master wing of Han Dune's fortress, the air was still, heavy with the scent of sterile medical-grade air and the faint, lingering trail of jasmine that Nia had brought into his sterile world. Dune stood in the doorway of the guest suite, his frame casting a long, jagged shadow across the plush cream carpet. He had shed his tuxedo jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos that spiraled like ink smoke around his forearms. Marks of a life spent in the trenches of the underworld. On the oversized bed, Isla and Arya were entwined in sleep, a tangle of limbs and dark braids. They looked impossibly small against the vastness of the silk duvet. Their breathing was perfectly synchronized, a soft, rhythmic huffing that seemed to be the only honest sound Dune had heard in years. He watched the way their eyelashes cast long shadows against their cheeks, and how their small hands clutched at the pillows with a subconscious need for anchor. For a man who had spent his life calculating risks and predicting betrayals, the sight of them was a mathematical anomaly. 5 years. They were 5 years old. The timeline was a jagged blade that cut through his logic. 6 years ago, London had been a blur of drugged shadows and desperate heat. He had left that room thinking he was escaping a trap, never imagining he was leaving behind a legacy. He stepped closer, his movements silent, the predator within him suppressed but never truly gone. He reached out, his hand hovering inches above Arya's head. His fingers, which had broken bones and pulled triggers without a tremor, were shaking now. He was terrified to touch them, terrified that his very presence, the sheer weight of his darkness, would wake them into the nightmare he inhabited. He had spent his life building a kingdom of shadows, and now, the light was sleeping in his bed, and he didn't know how to look at it without blinding himself. A soft chime echoed from the hallway. Dune straightened, his face hardening instantly into the mask of the dragon. He stepped out of the room, closing the door with a click so precise it was nearly silent. Jin-Ho was waiting in the corridor, holding a tablet and a sealed manila envelope. The bodyguard's face was unreadable, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there at the gala. He knew what was inside that envelope. He knew that if the contents were what they suspected, the entire geopolitical map of the Seoul underworld was about to be redrawn in blood. The results? Boss, Jin-Ho whispered. The medical team processed it in the private lab downstairs. They bypassed the national database as you ordered. No trail. No leaks. Dune took the envelope. The paper felt heavy like lead. He didn't open it immediately. He walked back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of the main living area, staring out at the rain that continued to lash against the glass. And Nia? Dune asked, his voice a low vibration. She's stable, sir. The doctors say the panic attack was exacerbated by the lingering effects of the stress and whatever she's been running from. She's sleeping. They've started her on a vitamin 4 to combat the exhaustion. Dune nodded, his eyes fixed on the lights of the city. He thought of her in that corner at the gala, pinned by Dominic Reed. He thought of the bruises he had seen on her soul, if not her skin. The rage that had been simmering in his gut since the wrong room in London began to boil, a cold, dark tide that threatened to drown his restraint. He tore the envelope open. The clinical white of the paper glared back at him under the recessed LED lights. He skipped past the medical jargon, the descriptions of loci and alleles, his eyes searching for the only number that mattered. 99.99% probability of paternity. The world seemed to tilt. The Dragon of Seoul, the man who had survived assassinations and corporate wars, felt the floor drop out from under him. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to see the truth rendered in the cold, unyielding ink of a lab report. They were his. Those girls, with their amber eyes and their fierce, protective love for their mother, were his blood, his breath, his future. Isla, Arya. He whispered the names to the empty room, tasting them like a foreign language he was finally beginning to understand. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the window. For 5 years they had existed in the world without him. They had been cold, They had been hungry. They had been hunted by a man like Dominic Reed, while Dune sat in his ivory tower counting his billions. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in his chest. He had been a ghost to them, and in his absence, Nia had been forced to become a warrior. Jin-ho, Dune said, not turning around. Yes, boss. The $50,000 bet. You said the money came from the Choi Syndicate? Verified, sir. Dominic Reed didn't just stumble into Nia. He was placed there. The Choi family wanted a way to compromise you before you took over the chair. They didn't realize Nia would disappear. They've been looking for her as long as you have, boss. Not for love. For leverage. Dune's hand crumpled the DNA report into a ball. The Choi Syndicate had used his blood, the most sacred thing in his world, as a pawn in a gutter game. They had allowed his daughters to grow up in the shadows so they could one day use them as a knife against his throat. They made a mistake, Dune said, his voice dropping to a level that made Jin-ho instinctively take a half-step back. They thought Nia was a weakness. They thought those children were a liability. He turned around, and the look in his eyes was no longer human. It was the look of a god who had discovered someone had been burning his temples. They gave me a reason to exist beyond the shadows, Jin-ho. And in doing so, they've ensured their own extinction. What are your orders, sir? Dominic Reed first, Dune commanded. I want him alive, but I want him broken. I want him to watch as every cent of that $50,000 bet is stripped from his life, multiplied by 1,000. Every person who touched Nia, every person who made those children cry. I want their names. And as for Choi Sung-woo, Dune walked over to a lacquer cabinet and pulled out a heavy, traditional Korean short sword, a family heirloom that hadn't seen blood in a generation. He unsheathed it, the steel gleaming in the dim light. Tell Choi that the dragon isn't coming for his territory anymore. I'm coming for his lineage. He tried to steal my 5 years. I'm going to take his eternity. He walked back to the guest suite, pausing at the door once more. He looked at the twins, so peaceful and unaware that the world was about to catch fire on their behalf. He realized that the 5-year secret wasn't just about paternity. It was about the fact that he had been dead for 5 years, and tonight he had finally been born. He didn't believe in fate, but as he looked at the DNA report on the floor, he knew that the wrong room in London had been the only right place he had ever been. He was no longer just a boss. He was a father. And heaven help the man who tried to stand between a father and his pride. Rest while you can, my little dragons, he whispered to the darkness. Tomorrow your father begins the hunt. He closed the door, the click echoing like the first shot of a war that would change everything. The 5-year secret was out, and the dragon was finally, truly, awake. The rain over Seoul had transitioned from a violent downpour to a persistent, ghostly mist that clung to the glass towers of the Gangnam district. High above the city, in a sub-level executive suite of the Han Syndicate's secondary headquarters, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the ozone of high-end servers. Kang Min-suk, the syndicate's chief of operations and a man whose ambition was as sharp as the crease in his charcoal-gray trousers, sat behind a desk of polished obsidian. He was not a dragon like Dune. He was a viper, a creature that thrived in the tall grass of bureaucracy and whispered betrayals. For years, Min-suk had watched Dune rule with an iron-fisted restraint that he considered a waste of potential. To Min-suk, power was not a shield to protect the status quo. It was a blade meant to be thrust into the heart of the world. Min-suk stared at a high-resolution monitor displaying a grainy, thermal-enhanced image from the Gala's security perimeter. It showed Dune, the untouchable dragon, hunched over in the rain, his hand resting on the heads of 2 small children. The sight made Min-suk's lip curl in a mixture of disgust and predatory delight. He had known Dune was hiding something, a flicker of humanity that had recently begun to dull his lethal edge, but he had never expected a bloodline. In the underworld, a secret like this wasn't just a scandal. It was a catastrophic structural failure in a man's armor. The DNA courier was intercepted 10 minutes after leaving the lab. A voice crackled from the shadows of the office. A man stepped forward, a tech specialist with eyes that twitched from too many hours spent decoding encrypted streams. He placed a digital tablet on Min-suk's desk. We couldn't take the physical report without alerting Duyun's personal guard, but we mirrored the data transmission. It's a match, Min-suk. Those girls carry the Han signature. They are the dragon's heirs. Min-suk leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking like a warning. He felt a surge of cold electricity. For 6 years, the syndicate had wondered why Duyun never took a wife, why he never sought to secure his lineage. They thought he was a monk of the shadows. But the truth was far more delicious. He had a family, a black queen and 2 biracial princesses hidden in the folds of a London nightmare. To the conservative elders of the syndicate, this was more than a breach of protocol. It was a dilution of the pure Han legacy. But to the rival Choi syndicate, it was something far more practical. It was a leash. Duyun thinks he can play the hero? Min-suk whispered, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, haunting beat on the desk. He thinks he can bring the light into our world and not expect the shadows to swallow it whole. He's forgotten that a dragon with a nest is just a target. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out toward the distant, glowing silhouette of Duyun's penthouse. He could almost feel the warmth of the sanctuary Duyun was trying to build, and it offended him. The syndicate was built on the premise that they were above the petty attachments of ordinary men. By claiming these children, Duyun had declared himself a man, and men could be broken. Get me a secure line to Choi Sung-woo, Min-suk commanded, not turning around. Sir? Contacting the rival syndicate is high treason. If the boss finds out, the boss is currently compromised by a woman and 2 toddlers, Min-suk snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He is no longer the man who built this empire. He is a father. And a father is a man who can be bargained with. Choi has been looking for Nia Laurent since London. He wants the leverage she represents. I want the throne Duyun sits on. It's a simple trade of assets. The connection was made through a series of encrypted relays that bounced from Seoul to Singapore to a ghost server in Zurich. When the screen flickered to life, the face of Choi Sung-woo appeared. Choi was the antithesis of Duyun. Where Duyun was controlled and silent, Choi was flamboyant and erratic, a man who enjoyed the theater of cruelty. His eyes widened when he saw Min-suk, a jagged smile spreading across his face. Min-suk, Choi drawled, his voice like sandpaper on silk. To what do I owe the pleasure of a call from the dragon's most loyal dog? Has Dune finally decided to surrender the Incheon docks? The docks are irrelevant, Choi, Min-suk said, his tone flat and businesslike. I'm calling because the dragon has found his lost treasure, and I think you'll find the contents of his penthouse far more valuable than a few shipping containers. Choi's smile vanished, replaced by an intense, hungry focus. Explain. Nia Laurent is in the penthouse, and she didn't come alone. She brought the Han bloodline with her. 2 girls, identical, 5 years old. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Choi Sung-woo let out a low, breathy laugh that sent a chill through the room. The London bet. It actually paid off. We thought the woman had died or aborted. We spent millions trying to track her, just to find a way to humiliate Duyun's father before he passed. But this is better. This is a perpetual ransom. I can give you the security codes for the penthouse's secondary elevator, Min-suk said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And I can ensure that the syndicate's internal sensors are recalibrating when your men arrive. But I want your word. Duyun is mine. You take the woman and the children to hold as your prize, but the removal of Han Duyun from the chairmanship must be absolute. I want the throne, and I want him dead. You're a cold bastard, Min-suk, Choi laughed. Selling out your own boss's children? I like it. Send the codes. My vanguard group is already in the city. We'll hit him while he's distracted playing daddy. By sunrise, the dragon will be a memory, and you'll be the new king of Seoul. Min-suk ended the call and felt a strange sense of peace. He wasn't a man of emotion. He was a man of equilibrium. To him, Duyun's sudden move toward fatherhood was a disruption in the market, a variable that needed to be eliminated to restore the purity of the syndicate's power. He imagined the look on Duyun's face when he realized that his sanctuary was actually a trap. He imagined the scent of jasmine being replaced by the smell of gunpowder and burning silk. He walked to a small bar in the corner of his office and poured himself a glass of aged whiskey. He raised it toward the window, toward the penthouse in the distance. "To the dragon," Min-suk toasted, his voice devoid of irony. "May you find the peace in death that you tried to find in life. You should have stayed a ghost, Dune. You should have never let them touch your coat." As he drank, he began to delete the logs of the mirror transmission from the lab. He was a professional, he would leave no trail. When the smoke cleared and Choi's men were retreating with their leverage, Min-suk would step in as the mourning brother-in-arms, the loyal lieutenant who would reluctantly take the reins to stabilize the syndicate. He would be the hero of the boardrooms, while Dune would be remembered as the man who burned his empire down for a night in London he should have forgotten. The snake's tongue had flicked, and the venom was already moving through the veins of the city. Min-suk set his glass down, his eyes cold and empty. He had no regrets. In the underworld, there was no room for fathers, only for survivors. And as the mist outside turned into a thick, suffocating fog, he prepared to watch the world he had helped build collapse into a beautiful, violent ruin. The betrayal was complete. The information was sold. The 5-year secret was no longer a shield for Dune. It was the target painted on his back. And as Min-suk turned off the lights in his office, leaving only the blue glow of the monitors, he knew that the dragon's fire was about to be tested by a winter it wasn't prepared for. He didn't care about the children. He didn't care about Nia. They were just data points in a larger equation. But he did care about the crown. And as the elevator hummed, taking him down into the heart of the city he intended to rule, he felt the first stirrings of a new era. The era of the snake. The golden light of the afternoon sun filtered through the sheer silk curtains of the penthouse, casting long, ethereal shadows across the Italian marble floors. Nia Laurent stirred beneath the weight of a duvet that felt like a cloud, her senses slowly returning from the heavy, drug-induced fog that had claimed her at the hospital. For a moment, she was suspended in the silence, her mind grasping for the familiar sounds of her cramped apartment. The hum of a faulty refrigerator, the distant siren of a London street, the soft breathing of her daughters in the bunk bed across the room. But there was only the rhythmic, expensive hush of a climate-controlled sanctuary. She bolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was vast, minimalist, and terrifyingly luxurious. Every piece of furniture looked like a museum exhibit, and the walls were adorned with art that hummed with the silent energy of a fortune. Memory hit her like a physical blow. The Gala, the rain, the suffocating grip of Dominic's hand on her wrist, and then the man. The man with the amber eyes who had moved like a shadow and spoken with the authority of a god. Isla? Arya? Her voice was a ragged whisper, her throat raw from the panic attack that had nearly extinguished her. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet sinking into a rug so soft it felt like moss. She was no longer wearing her ruined gala dress. Someone had changed her into a set of silk pajamas that smelled of expensive laundry soap and cedarwood. The realization sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She was in the lair of a predator. She knew the type. She had spent 6 years running from the high society monsters of London, only to find herself in the private quarters of the most whispered about man in Seoul. She reached the heavy oak door and pulled it open, expecting it to be locked. To her surprise, it gave way silently. She stepped out into a corridor lined with darkened glass and soft, recessed lighting. At the end of the hall, a soft giggling sound echoed. It was a sound she knew better than her own name. She followed it, her breath hitching, until she reached a sun-bathed living area that overlooked the entire city. There, sitting on a sprawling velvet sofa, were Isla and Arya. They weren't huddled in fear. They were eating breakfast from silver trays, their faces smeared with chocolate from what looked like the most expensive pastries Nia had ever seen. And sitting in an armchair opposite them, his sleeves rolled up and his tie discarded on a glass table, was Han Du-yoon. He was watching them with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of awe and profound sadness. In his hand he held a tablet, but his focus was entirely on the girls. When Nia stepped into the room, his head snapped up. The dragon was back in an instant, his eyes sharpening, his posture shifting into something lethal and alert. "Mummy!" Arya squealed, dropping a half-eaten croissant and sprinting across the room. Isla was a second behind her, and they both collided with Nia's legs, nearly knocking her over. Nia collapsed to her knees, pulling them into her arms, checking their faces, their hands, their eyes. "Are you okay? Did anyone hurt you? Why are we here?" "The nice man saved us, mummy," Isla said, her voice muffled against Nia's shoulder. "He let us ride in the big car. And he has a TV as big as a wall." Nia looked up over the heads of her daughters, her eyes meeting Duyun's. He had stood up, his tall frame dwarfing the furniture around him. He didn't move toward her, as if sensing that any sudden motion would send her back into a spiral of panic. "They are safe, Nia," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that resonated in the quiet room. "No one will touch them here. Or you." "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking despite her attempt at strength. "Why did you bring us here? I know who your people are. I've seen the news. You're Han Duyun. You're a monster." Duyun flinched. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of pain that passed so quickly she might have imagined it. "To the rest of the world, perhaps," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "But to you, I am a debt that has finally come due." He stopped 5 feet away, the light from the window catching the sharp line of his jaw and the scar beneath his ear. Nia stared at him, the fog in her mind beginning to clear. There was something about the way he stood, the tilt of his head, the way his shoulders squared, the specific, terrifying intensity of his amber gaze. It was a silhouette she had seen in her dreams and her nightmares for 6 long years. The scent of the room hit her then. Beneath the expensive leather and the city air, there was a trace of the cologne he had worn at the gala, but it was mixed with something else. Something from a darkened suite in Mayfair. Something from a night where the world had been small and hot and desperate. "London," she whispered, her hands tightening on her daughter's shoulders. "The Hyatt. 6 years ago." Duyun closed his eyes for a moment, as if the confirmation was a weight he had been carrying for an eternity. "The room was 402, he said softly. "The jasmine was so strong it made my head spin. And you were the only light in a city that was trying to kill me." Nia felt the room spin. The stranger from London. The man she had blamed for her ruin. The man she had hallucinated in the faces of 1,000 strangers. The man who had left her with 2 lives to protect, was standing in front of her. He wasn't a faceless ghost anymore. He was the Dragon of Seoul. "You were drugged," Duyun said, his voice dropping to a level intended only for her ears. "I found out this morning. Dominic Reed didn't just bet on you, Nia. He worked with my enemies to put us in that room together. It was a setup. I thought I was protecting you by leaving. I thought if I stayed, my enemies would kill you to get to me. I didn't know. I didn't know about them." He looked down at Isla and Arya, and for the first time, Nia saw the sheer vulnerability in him. This was the man who ruled the city's shadows, yet he looked terrified of 2 5-year-old girls. "I have spent 6 years looking for the woman from that room," Duyun continued, his eyes returning to hers. "I searched every corner of Europe. I never thought to look in my own backyard, until they touched my coat and I saw my own eyes looking back at me." Nia stood up slowly, her daughters sensing the change in the air and moving to stand by the sofa. She walked toward him, her fear of his world battling with the realization of who he was. She stopped just inches from him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "You're a Mafia boss," she said, her voice a whisper of accusation. "Your world is blood and fire. I spent 6 years keeping them away from men like you, and now you tell me you're their father? How can you be a sanctuary for them when you're the reason they're in danger?" "Because," Duyun said, his hand twitching as if he wanted to reach out but didn't dare, "I am the only one who can burn the danger away before it reaches the door. Dominic is gone, Nia. He will never touch you again. The Choi Syndicate. They think they can use you as a pawn. They are currently learning that I do not play games with my heart." He finally reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, a searing reminder of the night they had shared. "I am a monster, Nia. I won't lie to you about that. But I am your monster. And I will build a world for those girls where they never have to know what it's like to run. Nia looked into his amber eyes, the same eyes that stared back at her every morning when her daughters woke up. The panic was still there, but beneath it, a tiny, flickering flame of hope began to take hold. She was in a world of luxury built on shadows, but for the first time in 6 years, she didn't feel like she had to hold her breath. They need a father, Dune, she said, her voice steadier now. Not a king, not a dragon. Can you be that? Dune looked at the twins, who were now watching them with wide, curious eyes. He looked back at Nia, a slow, determined smile breaking across his face. A smile that promised both a beautiful future and a devastating war for anyone who tried to stop it. I will be whatever they need me to be, he vowed. But first, I have to finish the war that started in London. Stay in the penthouse. Don't leave the perimeter. Jin Ho and 40 of my best men are between you and the world. And where are you going? She asked, a sudden spike of worry hitting her. I'm going to remind the Choi Syndicate why people are afraid of the dark, Dune said. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting second. I've waited 6 years to find you, Nia. I'm not going to let a few ghosts take you away again. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his sleeves rolling down, his tie being pulled back into place. By the time the elevator doors opened, the father had vanished, and the dragon had returned. Nia watched the doors close, then turned back to her daughters. She looked around at the golden light and the luxury, realizing that her life had changed forever. She was no longer a runner. She was the queen in the dragon's nest. Is he coming back, Mummy? Arya asked, clutching a silver spoon. Nia walked over and pulled them both into her lap, looking out at the city that now felt like a kingdom. Yes, baby, she whispered. He's coming back. And this time he's staying. As the sun began to set over Seoul, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, Nia Laurent finally let out the breath she had been holding for 6 years. The fear was still there, but as she looked at the amber-eyed girls in her arms, she knew that for the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were being claimed. And heaven help anyone who stood in the way of Han Du-yoon's claim. The silence of the penthouse at midnight was heavy, a thick velvet blanket that seemed to absorb the distant, rhythmic pulse of Seoul's neon heart. Inside the master wing, Nia lay in a fitful sleep, her hand instinctively reaching out across the silk sheets as if searching for a tether in a storm. In the adjacent room, Isla and Arya were curled together, their breathing soft and synchronized. But in the shadows of the main gallery, Han Du-yoon was a statue of lethal intent. He had traded his dress shirt for a tactical black turtleneck, the fabric hugging a frame built for violence. He didn't need sleep, he needed a reckoning. The air in the penthouse suddenly shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a change in pressure, the subtle groan of the secondary elevator's pneumatic seal being bypassed. Du-yoon's eyes, amber and predatory in the dim light, snapped toward the hallway. The snake, Kang Min-suk, had done his work. The internal sensors remained dark, silenced by a traitor's hand, but Du-yoon didn't rely on technology. He relied on the instinct of a man who had survived 1,000 nights just like this one. He moved with the silence of a ghost, entering the girls' room before the first footfall echoed in the corridor. He didn't wake them with a shout. He leaned down, his large hands gently covering their mouths as their eyes flew open in the dark. "Shoo!" he breathed, the sound barely a vibration. "It's time for the game we talked about, the fortress game. Remember?" Isla and Arya nodded, their eyes wide but trusting. They had spent 5 years running from shadows. They knew when the air turned cold. Du-yoon lifted them both, one in each arm, and carried them to the back of the walk-in closet. He pressed a hidden panel disguised as a shoe rack, and a heavy, reinforced steel door slid open with a hiss. This was the heart of his home. A panic room equipped with its own oxygen supply, satellite comms, and enough ballistic shielding to survive a direct hit from a tank. Nia was already there, startled awake by Jin Ho moments before. Her face was pale, her eyes darting between Du-yoon and the blinking monitors inside the room. "Du-yoon, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He set the twins down and turned to Nia, his hands framing her face. For a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes thawed. "The Choi Syndicate thinks they can take what belongs to me," he said, his voice a low, tectonic promise. "They are wrong. Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me or Jin-ho. If the monitors go dark, there is an escape tunnel behind the vanity. Take the girls and run." "Dune, please." "I told you, Nia," he interrupted, pressing a firm kiss to her forehead. "I will burn the world to keep you warm. Tonight, the fire starts." He stepped out and the steel door sealed shut, leaving him alone in the darkness of the master suite. He reached into a hidden compartment in the wall and pulled out 2 customized HK-VP9s, checking the magazines with a mechanical precision that spoke of muscle memory. He didn't feel fear. He felt a terrifying, singular clarity. The first mercenary rounded the corner of the gallery. He was wearing the gray digital camo of the Vanguard Group, a high-end private military firm Choi Sung-woo favored. He didn't even have time to raise his suppressed rifle. Dune moved like a blur, closing the distance in 3 silent strides. He caught the man's throat with his left hand, crushing the windpipe, while his right hand drove the butt of the pistol into the temple. The mercenary went down without a sound. Dune didn't stop. He transitioned into the main living area, where 3 more shadows were fanning out, their laser sights dancing across the expensive art and Italian furniture. The dragon didn't use the lasers. He used the darkness. He dropped to one knee behind a marble kitchen island, his breathing steady, his heart a slow, rhythmic drum. *1, 2, 3. He rose and fired. 3 shots, 3 suppressed coughs of lead and cordite. The first mercenary was hit in the neck, the second in the center of the chest, and the third, the leader, took a bullet directly between the eyes. They fell like puppets with their strings cut, their blood staining the white marble floors that Nia had walked on only hours before. "Sector 1 clear." A voice crackled from a fallen radio. "Echo, do you copy? We have reached the primary bedroom. Preparing to breach for the assets." Dune picked up the radio, his thumb pressing the talk button. "Echo is dead," he said, his voice a cold, terrifying calm that caused the line to go silent for a heartbeat. "And so are you. You entered the wrong house, looking for the wrong family." He tossed the radio aside and moved toward the secondary elevator bank. He knew Choi wouldn't just send 5 men. This was a siege. Downstairs, in the lobby, Jin-ho and the loyalist guards were engaged in a full-scale firefight. But the elite Vanguard team had bypassed them using Min-suk's codes. They were already on his floor. He intercepted the next wave in the dining hall. 4 men, moving in a professional diamond formation. They were better than the first group, throwing a flashbang into the room to disorient him. But Dune had already closed his eyes, counting the seconds. As the white light exploded, he rolled behind a mahogany dining table, coming up on the flank. The room erupted into a symphony of silenced gunfire. Dune was a whirlwind of precision. He didn't just clean the house, he dismantled it. He used the environment as a weapon, shattering glass partitions to create obstacles, using the heavy furniture for cover, and moving with a predatory speed that made the mercenaries look like they were standing still. He was hit once, a grazing shot to his shoulder that tore through the black wool of his turtleneck, but he didn't even flinch. The pain was just another fuel for the fire. By the time he reached the final mercenary, the penthouse was a ruin of its former luxury. Bullet holes riddled the walls, and the scent of gunpowder hung thick in the air. The last man was backed against the floor-to-ceiling window, his rifle empty, his hands shaking as he reached for a combat knife. Dune walked toward him, his boots crunching on the glass of a shattered Swarovski chandelier. He didn't fire. He holstered his weapons, his eyes glowing with an amber light that made the mercenary stumble backward. "Who sent you?" Dune asked, his voice a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. I don't know. We were just given the codes. Vanguard doesn't ask names." Dune reached out, his hand wrapping around the man's throat, lifting him off the ground until his boots dangled over the Seoul skyline. "The codes came from inside my house," Dune growled. "Who was the contact? Was it Min-suk?" The mercenary's face turned purple, his hands clawing at Duyoon's iron grip. Yes, Min-suk. He said the dragon was soft. He said the kids were a liability. Do-yoon's grip tightened for a second, the sound of cartilage groaning under the pressure. Then he simply let go, dropping the man to the floor. He was wrong, Do-yoon said. The kids aren't a liability. They are the reason I'm going to enjoy killing every single one of you. He turned his back on the gasping man and tapped his earpiece. Jin-ho. Status. Lobby is secure, boss. We took 6 prisoners. The rest won't be talking. But Choi has a second team moving toward the Incheon docks. He thinks you're stuck here. I'm not stuck, Jin-ho, Do-yoon said, looking toward the panic room door. I'm finished. Secure the penthouse. Bring Nia and the girls to the secondary safe house in the mountains. I'm going to find Min-suk. And then, I'm going to find Choi. He walked back to the panic room and entered the override code. The door hissed open, and Nia practically fell into his arms, her hands frantically checking him for wounds. The twins peered out from behind her, their faces pale but brave. Are the bad men gone? Isla asked. Do-yoon knelt down, ignored the blood seeping through his shoulder, and pulled them both into a tight embrace. The bad men in this house are gone, he said softly, and I'm going to make sure the rest of them never find their way back. He looked up at Nia, his expression hard. I have to go. Min-suk betrayed us. He gave them the codes. Nia's eyes widened. The man you trusted? Dune, it's a trap. If you go out there now. If I don't go out there, this never ends, he said, standing up. Jin-ho will take you to the mountains. It's a fortress. You'll be safe there. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. I found you after 6 years, Nia. I am not letting go. But to keep you, I have to end this. All of it. He turned and walked out of the ruined penthouse, leaving the gold and the luxury behind. He didn't look like a billionaire anymore. He looked like a man who had rediscovered his soul and realized it was made of fire. As he stepped into the private elevator, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number, the same one that had sent the DNA results. Asterisk, the dragon cleans his house, but the snake has already moved to the garden. See you at the docks, Do-yoon. Let's see what your blood is really worth. Asterisk. Do-yoon's jaw tightened. The midnight breach was over, but the war for his legacy had only just begun. He wasn't just cleaning a house anymore. He was purging a kingdom. And by the time the sun rose over Incheon, there would be no snakes left to whisper. The early morning light over Seoul was not a herald of peace. It was a cold, clinical glare that exposed every crack in the city's facade. Han Do-yoon sat in the back of his armored sedan, the interior smelling of gun oil and the faint, lingering sweetness of the jasmine perfume Nia had worn. He wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at a digital dossier on a tablet, his thumb scrolling through the pathetic, bloated life of Dominic Reed. To a man like Do-yoon, death was a mercy, a quick exit from a world of debt. But for a man like Dominic, who had built his entire identity on the hollow pillars of inherited wealth and the exploitation of the vulnerable, there was a far more exquisite form of execution. Is everything in place? Do-yoon asked, his voice a low, raspy vibration that seemed to darken the air inside the car. Jin-ho, sitting in the front passenger seat, nodded without turning around. The forensic accountants have finished the deep dive. Every shell company, every offshore account used for the London bets, and every bribe paid to local officials has been mapped. We've also secured the original ledger from the Vanguard Group. It lists Dominic as the primary contractor for the extraction of Nia Laurent. He didn't just hurt her, boss. He put a price tag on her head. Do-yoon's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. The extraction of a mother and 2 children. He thought he was playing a game of chess. He's about to find out he's been playing with a landslide. The car pulled up to the curb of a luxury high-rise hotel in the heart of the Gangnam district. This was Dominic's temporary fortress, a place where he thought his family name and his remaining connections would shield him from the consequences of the Gala. He didn't know that the dragon had already swallowed the sun. Do-yoon stepped out of the car. He didn't wear a mask. He didn't carry a visible weapon. He walked through the lobby with the terrifying calm of a man who already owned the building. The hotel staff, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stepped aside as if he were a force of nature. By the time he reached the penthouse suite, the electronic locks had already been bypassed by his tech team. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a room that smelled of stale champagne and desperation. Dominic Reed was slumped on a white leather sofa, his broken arm in a crude sling, a bottle of expensive scotch clutched in his good hand. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a sudden, paralyzing terror. You can't be here," Dominic stammered, trying to stand but collapsing back into the cushions. "I have diplomatic immunity. My father, he has friends in the ministry. You touch me, and you'll have the whole country on your head." Dune didn't say a word. He walked to the center of the room and gestured to Jin Ho. A portable projector was set up on the coffee table, casting a bright, flickering image onto the far wall. "What is this?" Dominic yelled, his voice cracking. "What are you doing?" "This," Dune said, his voice as cold as a winter grave, "is the end of your world, Dominic. Watch closely. It's the only thing you'll ever own again." The screen showed a live feed of the global markets. In real time, the stock of Reed International, the family conglomerate that funded Dominic's lifestyle, was plummeting. Red lines cascaded down the graph like open veins. "I didn't just short your stock, Dominic," Dune said, walking toward the window. "I leaked the London ledgers to the International Monetary Fund. I leaked the video of you drugging women to every major news outlet in the UK and Korea. Right now, your father is being detained at Heathrow. Your board of directors has already signed a decree of disassociation. You aren't just broke. You are a pariah." Dominic's face went a sickly shade of gray. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he tried to log into his private accounts. No, I have offshore funds. Grand Cayman, Zurich. You can't touch those. Check them. Dune invited, his amber eyes glowing with a dark satisfaction. Dominic's screen flashed red. Asterisk account seized. Assets frozen by order of the High Court. Asterisk. "I don't need to kill you, Dominic," Dune said, leaning down until his face was inches from the smaller man's. The scent of the dragon, the smell of rain and cold iron, overpowered the scotch. "Death would be too easy for a man like you. You would be a martyr in your own twisted mind. No, I want you to live. I want you to live a long, very long life in a world that hates you." Dune reached out and plucked the scotch bottle from Dominic's hand, pouring the liquid onto the expensive rug. "By noon, this hotel will evict you. By evening, your name will be a curse word in every social circle you've ever craved. You will walk the streets of this city, and you will see my face on every billboard, knowing that I am the one who took the air out of your lungs." "Please," Dominic whispered, his bravado finally shattering. "I'll give you anything. I'll tell you about Choi. I'll tell you where Min-suk is hiding. Just leave me enough to get out of the country." "You have nothing to give," Dune replied. "I already have Min-suk's location. And Choi? Choi is a debt I will settle personally. You were never a player, Dominic. You were just the dirt on the bottom of the dragon's heel." Dune stood up, smoothing the front of his coat. He looked around the room, the luxury, the art, the pretense, and felt a profound sense of closure. This man had tried to buy Nia's dignity for $50,000. He had tried to turn Dune's daughters into mistakes. "One last thing," Dune said, pausing at the door. "The $50,000 you won on that bet 6 years ago? I've tracked the interest. It comes to exactly $112,000 today. I've taken that amount from your personal trust and donated it to a shelter for victims of domestic abuse in Nia's name. It was the only clean money you ever had. Now, even that is gone." Dominic fell to his knees, his face buried in his hands, a broken sound escaping his throat. He was a man stripped of his armor, left to face a world he had spent his life mocking. As Dune walked back to the elevator, the weight that had been pressing on his chest since the gala began to lift. He hadn't spilled a drop of blood in that room, but he had committed a far more absolute execution. He had erased Dominic Reed. "Jin Ho," Dune said as they reached the lobby. "Inform the security teams. The Reed variable is removed. Now we focus on the snake. Is the surveillance on the Incheon docks live?" "Yes, boss." We have eyes on the warehouse. Min-suk is there, meeting with Choi's lieutenants. They're preparing a final shipment, something they think will buy their way out of the country. Dune stepped back into the rain, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the industrial cranes of Incheon stood like skeletons against the gray sky. He had cleaned his house. He had erased his personal enemy. Now he had to decapitate the rival that threatened his family's future. They think they're shipping out, Dune said, his voice dropping to a growl. They're wrong. They're just waiting for the fire to arrive. The car sped away from the hotel, leaving a broken man in a gold-leafed cage. Dominic Reed was still breathing, but in the eyes of the dragon, he was already a ghost. The era of the mistake was over. The era of the Han legacy was just beginning. As the car wove through the morning traffic, Dune opened a secure video feed. It showed the mountain safe house. He saw Nia sitting on a terrace, the twins playing with a golden retriever in the grass behind her. For a moment he let himself breathe. He had taken everything from the man who tried to destroy them. Now he just had to ensure there was a world left for them to grow in. Faster, Dune commanded. The snake doesn't like to be kept waiting. The Dragon of Seoul was no longer just protecting his territory. He was reclaiming his soul one debt at a time. And as the city of Seoul woke up to the news of the Reed family's collapse, the underworld held its breath. They knew the dragon wasn't finished. He was just getting started. The Incheon docks were a skeletal landscape of rusted iron and salt-stained concrete, shrouded in a fog so thick it swallowed the beams of the industrial floodlights. This was the edge of the world, where the laws of the city dissolved into the cold, black rhythm of the Yellow Sea. Inside Warehouse 47, the air tasted of diesel and betrayal. Kong Min-suk stood near a stack of wooden crates, his tailored suit a sharp, arrogant contrast to the grime of the shipping yard. Beside him stood Choi Sung-woo, leaning against a black SUV, a cigarette dangling from his lips, as his men loaded the last of the laundered assets into a hidden compartment of a freighter. The dragon is dead, Min-suk, Choi drawled, blowing a plume of smoke into the damp air. Your codes worked perfectly. Vanguard confirmed the hit on the penthouse. Even if he survived the initial breach, he's a man with a leash now. A man with a family is a man who can be bled dry. Min-suk checked his platinum watch, his eyes devoid of anything resembling remorse. Dune was an anomaly. He tried to rule a kingdom of shadows with a heart of glass. It was only a matter of time before someone shattered it. I simply accelerated the inevitable. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse didn't burst open. They didn't scream on their hinges. Instead, the power to the entire sector simply died. The hum of the generators cut out, plunging the cavernous space into a terrifying, absolute darkness. The only sound was the sudden, sharp intake of breath from Choi's mercenaries and the distant, rhythmic lap of the tide against the pier. Then the emergency lights flickered to life. Not the bright white LEDs of the warehouse, but a low, crimson glow from the backup system. Standing in the center of the main loading bay, 30 yards from the snake and the rival king, was Han Dune. He was alone. He wasn't wearing a tactical vest or carrying a rifle. He was dressed in a black suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his hands empty at his sides. But the air around him seemed to warp with the sheer intensity of his presence. He looked like a god of war who had stepped out of a nightmare to claim a tithe of blood. Min-suk, Dune said, his voice a low, tectonic rumble that echoed off the corrugated steel walls. You always were better with numbers than with people. You calculated the cost of my betrayal, but you forgot to factor in the interest. Choi Sung-woo laughed, though the sound was tight, lacking its usual bravado. You're a ghost, Dune. My men are crawling all over your penthouse. You have nothing left to fight for. My men are currently cleaning the blood of your mercenaries off my carpet. Choi, Dune replied, taking a slow, measured step forward. And my family is in a place where your reach will never extend. You didn't send a team to kill a boss. You sent a team to threaten a father. That was your final mistake. Min-suk's face went pale. He reached for a weapon hidden beneath his jacket, but before his hand could even find the grip, a red laser dot bloomed on the center of his forehead. Then another on Choi's chest. From the darkened catwalks above, Jin Ho and 20 of Duyun's elite marksmen materialized like vengeful spirits, their suppressed barrels leveled with lethal precision. The vanguard group didn't tell you, did they? Duyun asked, his amber eyes glowing in the red emergency light. They don't work for the highest bidder. They work for the survivor. And I am the only one walking out of this warehouse tonight. Duyun walked toward Minsuk, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Choi's men dropped their weapons, realizing that the dragon hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to judge. Choi himself scrambled into the back of his SUV, but Jin Ho fired a single, disabling shot into the engine block, ending the escape before it began. Duyun stopped 3 feet from Minsuk. The snake was trembling now, the cold calculation of the boardroom replaced by the primal terror of the prey. I gave you everything, Minsuk, Duyun said. I gave you a seat at my table. I gave you my trust. And you sold the location of my children for a throne you weren't strong enough to sit on. Duyun, listen, it was business. Minsuk gasped, his voice cracking. The elders. They wouldn't have accepted them. I was trying to save the syndicate from a scandal. The syndicate is a collection of shadows, Duyun whispered, leaning in until his breath stirred the hair on Minsuk's temple. My daughters are the only real thing I have ever owned. You didn't just betray a boss. You tried to auction off my soul. Duyun didn't use a gun. He reached out, his hand wrapping around Minsuk's throat with the strength of a hydraulic press. He didn't squeeze immediately. He let the silence stretch, let Minsuk look into those predatory amber eyes and see the exact moment his life ended. You told Choi that the dragon was soft, Duyun growled. Let this be the last thing you ever feel. With a sudden, violent twist, the snake was silenced forever. Duyun let the body fall to the oil-stained concrete like a piece of discarded trash. He didn't look back at the man he had once called a brother. He turned his gaze toward the SUV where Choi Sung-woo was huddled. Jin Ho, Duyun commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. Take Choi to the black site. I want him to watch as we dismantle every pier, every ship, and every warehouse the Choi family owns. When there is nothing left of his name but dust, then, and only then, can he follow Minsuk. Yes, boss. Duyun walked out of the warehouse and into the cold Incheon rain. He felt the weight of the night finally begin to settle, but it wasn't a weight of burden. It was a weight of purpose. The internal rot was purged. The external threat was neutralized. The debt of London was finally moving into the black. 3 hours later, the sun began to peek through the gray clouds over the Han River. At the syndicate's primary headquarters, a fortress of steel and glass in the heart of Seoul, the entire organization had been summoned. 500 men in dark suits stood in the sprawling courtyard, their faces somber, their eyes fixed on the grand staircase. The air was electric with tension. Rumors of the night's violence had already permeated the ranks. They expected a purge. They expected a lecture on loyalty. The heavy double doors opened. Han Duyun stepped out. He was no longer the solitary, distant king they had known. He was dressed in a dark navy suit, his posture regal and unyielding. But he wasn't alone. On his right stood Nia Laurent. She was dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, her head held high, her eyes reflecting a strength that had been forged in 6 years of hardship. And on his left, holding his hands with a fierce, possessive pride, were Isla and Arya. The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute. Not a foot shifted. Not a breath was heard. Duyun walked to the edge of the stone balcony, looking out over the sea of men who represented his power. He didn't raise his voice, yet it carried to the very back of the ranks. For years, you have served the Han Syndicate, Duyun began, his voice clear and resonant. You have fought for territory, for money, and for a name. But a name without a future is just a ghost. He looked down at the twins, then up at his men. 6 years ago, a debt was created in London. Last night, that debt was settled in blood. These are my daughters Isla and Arya Han. And this is Nia Laurent, the woman who carried the Han legacy through the dark when I was too blind to see it. He paused, his amber eyes sweeping across the crowd. A silent challenge to anyone who dared to whisper a word of dissent. No one did. They saw the blood on his cuffs and the fire in his eyes, and they knew that the dragon had found something more dangerous than ambition. They are the first family of this syndicate, Dune declared, his hand tightening around Nia's. From this day forward, they are the line that shall not be crossed. My enemies are their enemies. My life is their shield. And if any man among you or any man in this city so much as breathes a threat against them, I will not just kill him. I will erase his history. He raised his hand, and as one, the 500 men bowed their heads in a deep, traditional salute of fealty. It wasn't just a salute to a boss. It was a salute to a dynasty. The era of the solitary dragon is over, Dune concluded. We are no longer just a syndicate. We are a house. And this house protects its own. He turned and led Nia and the girls back into the building. As the doors closed behind them, the courtyard erupted into a disciplined, rhythmic chant of his name. But Dune wasn't listening to the chant. He was looking at Nia, who was watching him with a mixture of relief and dawning realization. You really did it, she whispered as they reached the private elevator. You told them. I told the world. Nia, he said, pulling her close as the twins began to explore the high-tech interior of the elevator. You spent 6 years hiding. You're never going to hide again. You are the Queen of Seoul now. And those girls, they are the princesses of the only kingdom that matters. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The hunt is over, Nia. We're home. As the elevator rose toward the penthouse, Dune felt a peace he hadn't known since that night in London. He had executed the traitor. He had claimed his family. He had turned his darkness into a fortress. But as the doors opened to his sanctuary, his phone buzzed. Private, encrypted line. Asterisk, a beautiful ceremony, Dune. Truly touching. But did you really think the London bet ended with Dominic? The $50,000 was just the beginning. I'm coming to collect the real interest. Asterisk. Dune's eyes narrowed, the amber light returning to his gaze. He looked at Nia and the twins, who were laughing as they ran toward the view of the city. He didn't show them the message. He simply deleted it. The dragon had found his home. And God help the ghost who tried to knock on his door. The dragon had found his home. And God help the ghost who tried to knock on his door. The vow has been spoken, and the first family is official. But a new shadow is rising from the past. Before we move into the final chapter of part 1, tell me in the comments. Who do you think is sending these mysterious messages? Is it a ghost from London or someone closer to home? I read every comment, and your theories helped the family grow. Like and subscribe for the finale. The seasons in Seoul had shifted from the biting, icy grip of winter to the lush, suffocating heat of midsummer, and finally into the crisp, golden clarity of autumn. 6 months had passed since the night at the Incheon docks. 6 months since Han Dune had officially reclaimed his bloodline and purged the snake from his garden. To the outside world, the Han Syndicate had transformed into a legitimate global powerhouse, its jagged edges smoothed over by the sudden, stabilizing presence of a family. The dragon was no longer a myth of violence. He was a man seen in the park on Sunday mornings, a man who attended parent-teacher conferences with 4 armed guards and a toddler on each hip. Tonight, the penthouse was filled with the soft, domestic music of a life reclaimed. The floor-to-ceiling windows were dark, reflecting the amber glow of the dining room's crystal chandelier. Nia sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her skin glowing in the candlelight, looking every bit the Queen Dune had promised she would be. Isla and Arya were engrossed in a debate over dessert, their identical faces lit with a joy that had once seemed impossible. They were safe. They were whole. They were home. Dune watched them from the head of the table, his hand resting over Nia's. The scars on his knuckles were fading, hidden beneath the cuff of a soft cashmere sweater. For the first time in his 34 years, the constant low-frequency hum of survival instinct in his brain had gone quiet. He had built a fortress, and inside it he had found peace. You're staring again? Nia whispered, a playful smile dancing on her lips as she squeezed his hand. I'm just making sure you're real, Dune replied, his voice a low, warm rasp. Sometimes I still expect to wake up in that London hotel room alone. Nia's expression softened, her thumb tracing the line of his wedding band. A simple platinum circle they had exchanged in a private ceremony 3 months prior. "You're not alone anymore, Dune. You haven't been for a long time." The peaceful atmosphere was punctured by the subtle, electronic chime of the penthouse's private elevator. Dune's posture didn't change, but Nia felt the muscle in his forearm tighten. Old habits died hard. Jin-ho stepped into the dining room, his face unusually pale. He wasn't carrying a tactical rifle or a tablet. In his gloved hands, he held a silver tray, upon which sat a single square envelope. It was made of heavy, obsidian black paper, sealed with a red wax stamp that bore a symbol Dune hadn't seen in half a decade. A serpent entwined around a broken crown. "Boss," Jin-ho said, his voice strained. "This was delivered to the lobby by a courier who vanished into the crowd before we could intercept. It's marked for your eyes only." Dune felt a sudden, icy chill settle in the marrow of his bones. He looked at Nia, who had gone still, her eyes fixed on the black envelope. He reached out and took it, the paper feeling unnaturally cold against his skin. He didn't open it at the table. He stood up, kissing Nia's temple and murmuring a soft reassurance to the twins before stepping into his private study. The study was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, but as Dune broke the wax seal, it felt like a cage. He reached inside the envelope and pulled out a single high-gloss photograph. His heart didn't just stop. It felt as though it had been physically seized by a frozen hand. The photograph was not of his enemies. It was a bird's-eye view of room 402 at the London Hyatt, taken 6 years ago. It was a perspective no human could have had, the angle of a pinhole camera hidden in the ceiling crown molding. The image was grainy but sharp enough to capture everything. The chaotic state of the sheets, the moonlight spilling through the velvet curtains, and the two figures entwined on the bed. He saw himself, drugged and desperate, and he saw Nia, her face buried in his neck. But it was the timestamp in the bottom corner that made the world tilt. It didn't just list the hour and the minute. It listed the heartbeat. Beneath the photo, there was a small piece of parchment with a single sentence written in elegant, hand-calligraphed ink. "Did you really think a dragon finds a diamond by accident?" The room was booked. The toxin was measured. The woman was chosen. You didn't find your family, Dune. We grew them for you. Now the harvest begins. Dune's breath hitched. A sickening realization began to wash over him, layer by layer, like a rising tide of poison. He remembered the ease with which he had found the unlocked door. He remembered how Nia just happened to be in that specific elevator at that specific second. He had spent 6 months thinking he was a hero who had rescued his family from a cruel twist of fate. But the truth was far more terrifying. Every moment of the last 6 years, the pain, the pregnancy, the random encounter at the Gala in Seoul, had been a choreographed movement in a symphony he wasn't conducting. Nia wasn't a girl he had happened to meet. She was a variable selected for her genetic compatibility and her lack of powerful connections. The twins weren't a miracle. They were a project. He felt the rage return, but it was different now. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of the dragon. It was a cold, absolute vacuum. Someone had played God with his life. Someone had used the woman he loved and the children he worshipped as biological chess pieces. He heard a soft footfall behind him. He didn't turn around. He didn't want Nia to see the photograph. He didn't want her to know that the night that had defined her life was nothing more than a recorded experiment. "Dune?" Nia's voice was hesitant. "What was in the letter? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's nothing, Nia," he said, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. He crumpled the photograph in his fist, the paper sharp against his palm. "Just some unfinished business from the Choi Syndicate." "You're lying," she said softly, walking toward him. She reached out, her hand touching the small of his back. "I can feel you shaking. Tell me." He turned to her, his amber eyes burning with a terrifying, newfound fire. He looked at her beautiful, trusting face, and then he looked toward the doorway where his daughters were playing. He realized then that the war at the docks hadn't been the finale. It had been the opening act. The real enemy wasn't a rival boss or a traitorous lieutenant. The real enemy was the person who had the power to script a man's destiny. "Nia," he said, his voice dropping to a level of intensity that made the air in the room vibrate. I need you to take the girls and Jin Ho. Go to the airport. Don't ask questions. Don't pack. Just go. Why? Dune, you're scaring me. Because, he said, his eyes fixing on the black envelope on his desk. I just realized our meeting in London wasn't an accident, and if they could plan our past, they've already planned our future. I'm going to find out who holds the pen, and then I'm going to break their hands. Before we close this chapter, I want to say a massive thank you to all of you for riding with the dragon. This story is growing because of your support. If you haven't joined the inner circle yet, please hit that like and subscribe button. It's how we keep this family strong. And for the new members, I read every single message, so drop a comment below and tell me, what city and country are you watching from tonight? Let's see how far the dragon's reach truly goes. Part 1 ends as the elevator doors in the lobby downstairs open, and a man identical to Han Do-yoon, but with cold, gray eyes, steps out into the light, holding a matching black envelope. The dragon thought he was the king of the board. He didn't realize he was just the most expensive piece. Tell me in the comments, who do you think the man in the lobby is? A brother? A clone? Or something even darker? I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear your theories.